A solitary night shift worker, an isolated roadside diner, and a locked door. It is the classic setup for internet horror, where isolation usually implies that something monstrous is about to walk in from the dark. The bell rings, the door opens, and the customers walking through the door are various versions of the waitress herself. The narrator serves coffee to different ages of herself who never made it home. To understand the trap she is in, we have to look at her starting conditions. The waitress arrives at the dhaba physically isolated for her shift, but she is already psychologically trapped long before she clocks in, caught in the grip of a severely abusive marriage. This story uses the tropes of a supernatural haunting to investigate the specific internal walls that keep a person anchored in a cycle of domestic abuse. Facing these ghosts is the first step toward the exit. The haunting begins at 1 a.m. Customers start filling the booths, and the waitress recognizes all of them. They are the 17, 24, and 31-year-old versions of herself. Each apparition carries the physical evidence of a specific trauma. The teenager cries over failed exams. The 24-year-old sits in torn clothes, whispering about being hit. The 31-year-old stares in shock at her own blood-stained hands. Look at this timeline representing her life. In psychology, there is a concept called counterfactual thinking, our human tendency to create possible alternatives to life events that have already occurred. Here, we see those alternatives splintering backward into distinct dead-end branches of regret. Evaluating past mistakes usually functions as a survival mechanism to help us avoid future threats. But for victims of ongoing trauma, looking backward into unchangeable history causes complete paralysis, snapping them right back into their present reality. You can see the psychological bitterness of this unchanging reality reflected in their physical orders at the diner. Every single version orders the exact same thing: black coffee, no sugar. There is no variance and no sweetness. They exist only to stare at the current waitress and warn her not to waste her survival. Endlessly revisiting past trauma without taking present action only reinforces the walls of the trap the victim is already living in. The real danger arrives when the timeline shifts forward. A 42-year-old version of the waitress, gray-haired with empty eyes, sits down in booth 7. Her regret isn't about a past mistake. She is the version that stayed. She never left the abusive husband, she refused the escape job in Delhi, and she never told her daughter she loved her before a fatal accident. This encounter introduces the horror of a future already written in stone. The threat is no longer a memory, but the heavy, looming reality of permanent stasis. We can see the overarching mechanics of the trap on this floor plan of the diner. It functions as a literal collection point. As the glowing dots duplicate and settle into the booths, they demonstrate what happens to those who stay too long. Remaining in a toxic situation eventually erodes a person's identity. The longer the inaction lasts, the more the self dissolves, until the individual is merely a ghost of their lost potential, sitting in the dark. The diner physically manifests the psychological death caused by domestic inaction. It is a waiting room for women who gave up their agency. Faced with the physical embodiment of her own ruined future, the protagonist finally moves. She abandons the diner counter, runs out the back door into the night, and completely ignores her abuser. Her phone lights up with 47 missed calls from her husband, but her trajectory is set. She is heading to Delhi tonight, and she is taking her daughter with her. Decades of clinical research define learned helplessness as the state where a subject endures repeated pain until they stop trying to avoid it. The terrifying physical touch of the 42-year-old version, the cold hand of her own wasted future, is what finally shatters that paralysis. The dread in this story stems from a preventable choice. The protagonist is not cursed by an external force. She is simply watching the consequences of remaining while she still has the power to leave. It shows how modern internet horror is evolving into contemporary folklore. These stories are being built specifically to process real-world domestic trauma, creating monsters that represent the psychological hurdles of escape. The ghosts of what if will always be waiting in the booths. But toxic spaces will only collect us if we choose not to walk out the door.